Emerging at the crossroads of Europeans' Napoleonic era and Victorian era was the birth of England naturalist Charles Darwin in 1809. Despite a struggling childhood with the early death of his mother and psychological problems with anxiety and grief, Darwin transpired into a top scholar at both Edinburgh University and Christ's College in Cambridge, studying natural theology and biology.
The result was a brilliant naturalist who, through observation and vast zoology studies and research and past scientists studying the development of organisms, devised the theory of evolution. This theory in general purposely sparked radical reactions in both church institutions and varying science fields, and further influenced society and economics in the form of social Darwinism, the revolution Charles Darwin himself failed to see.
You hit me once, I hit you back. You gave a kick, I gave a slap. You smashed a plate over my head, then I said...
The theory as a whole was derived from previous intellectuals. Aristotle began the idea with his great chain of being, which listed all known life forms from the simplest to the most complex. Lamarck, a zoologist from France, became the forerunner of evolution, being the first to state that a species had an inner force that caused them to develop the necessary tools for survival. However, Lamarck only believed that a species could develop new organs. It was English philosopher Herbert Spencer who predicted that over time the simplest organism could become more and more complex.
Darwin finalized these theories with his own as outlined in his Origin of Species, published in 1859. He originally proposed the component of natural selection, commonly known as the survival of the fittest. Natural selection stems from the idea that over time a species will gain certain biological traits as it adapts to the changed environment, therefore losing previous traits as well. Survival of the fittest became the commonly accepted name for the idea because those species that adapted to the environment as it changed, the fittest, survived into present-day world. Through Darwin's observations, he was able to see the resemblance between bird fossils and mammal fossils from his studies on the coast of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego with the birds and mammals of his day.
Yet Darwin didn't stop there. He further pushed his theory with the publication of The Descent of Man in 1872. This finalized his evolution ideas by subjecting it to humans. In his proposal, humans derived from a much more primitive state than they existed. Through survival of the fittest, humanity grew to the top of the great chain of being by developing and changing biological traits. This idea challenged the previous belief derived from religion that humans were simply created, opening up a heated discussion for scientists and religion fanatics who saw this theory as dangerous to the Christian belief and view that God is all-powerful.
The science fields tended to accept and adopt Darwin's theory rather than reject it. As a matter of fact, his beliefs actually began to reform some of the fields. Dating all the way back to the beginning of the scientific revolution, Darwin backed his theories on facts and science, not on perspective and beliefs. This was much like how Nicholas Copernicus's heliocentric theory, despite being originally critiqued because of it seemingly defined the power of God and the importance of humanity, was based on math and reason. That theory, too, came to be widely accepted and built upon, and is today our understanding of the universe.
Similar to the development of the heliocentric theory, Darwin's ideas began to flourish in the world of science. Darwin received praise from many organizations for the publications of his work. Going further, for example, the Netherlands Zoological Society, under the presidency of A. van Bemmelen, sent Darwin photographs of further fossils and species for observations, helping to defend his theory.
However, the true importance lies in the fact that the theory of evolution, specifically natural selection, became a ground for the biological study of DNA and genetics. When a species reproduces, it passes down the genetics to the next generation. With natural selection, the fittest survive because their genetics mutate to bring on features, whether it be physical or psychological, that adapted because of a change in the environment. This being said, Darwin's theory introduced the world to a further study of genetics and DNA, helping further the knowledge in biology, resulting in molecular biology and biochemistry.
Overall, the science aspect of the theory of evolution continued to reform science in the sense that scientific laws need to be based on reason and facts, not perspective and religious beliefs. It caused a reaction within the sciences that pushed scientists to later discover more anatomical and physiological features of species, specifically DNA, that contribute to the knowledge we know of today.
Despite early research on evolution, prior to Darwin, much of the world still believed in solely creationism, the idea that every species was created as they are by a supernatural being, or in the common religious belief, God. This was most likely due to the lack of publication and research by the other intellectuals. Jim Endersby, a historian of science at the University of Sussex, states in an interview with NPR,
"What really impressed people with Darwin's work was not the idea itself, but the book. It was the fact that there was so much detail, so much evidence,
The lack of knowledge on evolution, despite Darwin's vast research and factual information, created a strong radical reaction against evolution and the teaching of it within church institutions. Even though Europe had gone through both the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, people were still not ready to let go of all medieval religious ideas, such as that of creationism. At first, many individuals, within Europe and other parts of the world, believed that evolution denied the power of God, and more importantly, the dominance of humanity, since they were equated with lesser primates.
The prime example of this is in the United States Supreme Court case commonly known as the Scopes Monkey Trial, where Darwinism was prohibited from being taught in public schools. When teacher John T. Scopes broke this law, he was put on trial and the Supreme Court ruled him guilty. The law was based on religious influence, focusing on creationism, oppressing Darwin's ideas, and by siding with the ruling, the Supreme Court showed the country's and ultimately the world's reaction in rejecting Darwin's theories.
Yet, this reaction soon turned to a new reform, as many church institutions began to accept Darwinism and evolution, focusing on the idea that by creating organisms capable of evolving, God proves to be more powerful than before. This is shown in an NPR broadcast where Charles Kingsley's, a leader minister of the Church of England, response to Darwin and evolution is quoted.
Kingsley writes back to say, it's just as noble a conception of God to think that he created animals and plants that then evolved, that were capable of self-development, as it is to imagine that God has to constantly create new forms and fill in the gaps that he's left in his own creation. And Darwin is very pleased with this quote, and with Kingsley's permission he has it quoted in the next edition of The Origin.
Europe, from a religious perspective, failed to accept the immediate idea of evolution, yet grew to acknowledge its factual accuracy and depiction over time. This reform helped move Christian churches and governments away from being influenced by each other. Despite the radical reaction of rejection and hatred towards Darwin's theories, Europe and ultimately the world eventually began to accept them. However, religion was not the only aspect of a society that grew into utilizing Darwinism over time.
Darwinism may have seen some resistance, but the field of society it truly began to thrive in was the social scene. From a social science perspective, intellectuals used it to explain the resemblance between human community and that of community in nature. Yet the influential humans of the time, the power-hungry and wealthy industrialists, utilized Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest to defend their power, wealth, and influence from being taken away or limited by governments. David Sloan Wilson writes in his book, Evolution for Everyone,
social scientists treat the life sciences as enclosed within a kind of impermeable wall. Inside the wall, evolutionary thinking is deemed capable of producing powerful and astonishing truths. Outside the wall, in the realm of human behavior, applications of evolutionary thinking are typically treated as irrelevant at best, usually as pernicious, wrong, and downright dangerous.
In both Europe and America, industry continued to be on the rise. Despite Europe's previous industrial revolution occurring in the 1700s, the continent continued to develop new technology in order to compete with the uprising of American industry. The industrial revolutions were all led by the nicknamed robber barons, or wealthy individuals who rose up to the top of society and thrived by owning and running businesses and industries. Industrialists adopted the theory of social Darwinism. Originally developed by Herbert Spencer, the idea focused on the concept of survival of the fittest. In other words, the fittest of society would rise to the top in intellects or industry, putting the common people down. For a time, this idea was widely accepted in reformed society to accept the notion that only opportunity lay in being the exception and rising into industry, and to allow those with power and wealth to remain all-powerful. Governments were incapable of limiting power and growth in industries until later in time.
Later, in the early 1900s, the worldwide movement of progressivism also undertook social Darwinism, not to defend large business and industrialists, but rather to fight them and push society out of a reliance on the large business. Progressivists wanted to increase the number of fit so that more of society could survive in the modern world. They called for reforms in industry, the working world, home life and family raising, and others alike. By backing up arguments with social Darwinism, progressivists made progress and caused reforms throughout the world that brought society out of reliance on large industry.
All in all, Charles Darwin was a man who simply desired to push his studies and beliefs onto society in order to advance into a more modern world. In introducing the world to a theory they were not entirely ready to receive, his theory of evolution obtained vast reactions.
Science tended to accept and build off of his theory, but both religion and social views turned radical. Conservative religious fanatics rejected the idea and used influence to cause governments to reject it as well. Socially, society utilized the theory, focusing on the survival of the fittest to reform the world, whether with industrialists to maintain their power, or with progressivists to reform society as to allow everyone to adapt and survive into the future world.
Darwin failed to predict the entirety of the reactions to his theory, and especially not the reforms it caused in society and the near revolutionary changes it brought into the world.